So for those that are fairly new members, you'll see that we are a nonprofit organization. Okay. We are a large community of outdoor enthusiasts, so across Canada, US. So depending on your discipline, there is someone in our club that will probably share that same passion as you. And the WCA also owns my CCR, which is Canadian Canoe Routes. So if you're not very familiar with that, if you're interested in a particular sort of river or lake that you want to paddle, most chances are there's information on that particular route on the CCR website. So a great resource to find trip information. And it's also a great way to meet people. So again, depending on what your background is or what you're planning on getting into, many people in our club that are willing to definitely join in your passion and possibly meet up for an outing. And just like the previous generation, we like to pay it forward. So just like the previous generation did with us, now it's our turn to pass on that information, that knowledge, and carry on that tradition. So here's just a few action shots of when we go camping. The winter time is actually a very beautiful time to go out. Very quiet. You'll get certain smells and sounds that you normally don't get in the summertime or any other season for that matter. This particular shot was minus 35 without the wind chill that particular morning. So when we talk about winter camping as a whole, we can actually break that down into two separate categories. On the left, cold tenting. The North Face has done a fantastic job of marking these tents as the go-to for their cold tents. These tents do not have a stove inside. You can barely sit up in them at best. They are made out of nylon. Nylon is a little bit more abrasive resistant for the snow. On the other side, we have hot tenting. This uses a wood burning stove. When we talk about canvas, we always talk about or referencing cotton. These tents are much larger. You can actually sit up in them. You can actually stand up with them. And again, very large, okay? We will be talking about hot tenting this particular webinar. And of course, we'll be talking about the both different styles of pros and cons of each. So hot tenting, what is it? So uses a canvas cotton tent with a portable wood stove. When cotton gets damp, it swells, tightening the weave fabric, and that what makes it water resistant and not waterproof. Because if the actual tent itself gets wet enough, it will actually penetrate through, which happened to me a few years ago. Typically, do not have a floor inside your tent. Actually, don't want a floor inside, and we'll talk about that later on. Modern hot tentings are a lot easier to set up and carry and transport as opposed to the Egyptian cotton tents, which were great quality, not designed for practicality in terms of going from location to location. So the main 3 points here of this particular slide is a typical combined weight of a 2-person tent and stove is about 23 kilos or 50 pounds. Typical time to set up is about 45 to 60 minutes, and then tear down time is about 60 to 90 minutes. And you're probably thinking, what are you doing that it takes that long to set up or break down a tent? And we'll talk about that. Because if you're used to 3-season camping and you're used to your 5 minutes or sitting down or breaking down your camp, it's a much different story for winter camping. And that really depends on the amount of people that you go with, the tent style that you have, and also the weather. I mean, if you're breaking down in a blizzard or a snowstorm with zero visibility, it can be a lot slower to actually break down your tent. And likewise, if you're actually setting up in a snowstorm, or if it's minus 35 with wind chill, it'll definitely take a lot longer. Any questions so far, people? All pretty good? If you do have a question at any point, feel free to unmute your mic and ask your question. So why go winter camping? I get this question asked a lot by people, non-campers, and the look of terror on their face when you say you're going winter camping. Of course, the first thing they'll say is you're gonna freeze. It's actually not like that, but yes, it's very interesting to look on their face when you say you're going camping in the winter time. So the first benefit is there are no bears to worry about because they're all hibernating. There are no bugs to worry about because most of them are dormant. Well, we're talking about the biting kind. There are bugs in the winter time, believe it or not, typically referenced as snow fleas. They come out when it's almost at the freezing mark to feed on the algae. Almost looks like someone actually sprinkled pepper on the floor. They're not biting, they don't cause any harm, but you'd be kind of curious to see why this whole patch has all these black dots on it. And now you're not waiting for your favorite route or river or hiking trip to thaw out to be able to enjoy the outdoors. I look forward to winter camping just as much as I look forward to 3-season canoe tripping or hiking. So the first question is, where do I start? Okay, so the thing is, winter camping literally is an extension of 3-season camping, which means that you still need your hat, you still need your mug, you still need your cutlery and the like. Now you just need some additional gear. And it really begins with the major piece of equipment, which is your tent, stove, and sleeping system. This is where most of the money lies, okay? So typical questions that I get asked about winter camping is, I'm new to winter camping, can I rent camping equipment? And absolutely you can. Mountain Equipment Company, or also known as a MEC, they do have their rental program, which you can rent winter camping gear, okay? Another question that I get asked is, can I try winter camping without the large financial commitment? Absolutely. And this is where the WCA comes in. I mean, I try to typically have one outing a year where people will use my tent and I share my gear and I guide you how to set that tent up. It's a great way to meet people, but I mean, with COVID and everything, putting a wrench into everything, we'll have to put that on ice. So no pun intended, but yes, that's our plan. Then another question I get asked a lot is, now where do I go winter camping? So some operating parks like Algonquin and Killarney offer year-round camping where you can, especially Killarney, where you can almost go anywhere you want. Algonquin's a little bit more limited. I think they limit you to the southern portion of the park and not the west gates, for example. I recommend starting with operating parks like Algonquin and Killarney. That way you can safely walk onto frozen lakes. Most of the time, especially in Killarney, they'll guide you or advise you whether you can walk on the actual lakes itself. And once you get more experience and confidence, then I recommend Crown Line camping, just because the first time you step onto a frozen lake, it's kind of eerie. You're like, this shouldn't happen normally, but it's a very awkward feeling the first time around. So absolutely. So once you get confidence, highly recommend Crown Line camping. Just a few action shots. Another image where it was absolutely still, not a cloud in the sky, but still was -35 with the wind chill. So now we're actually getting into clothing itself, or some of the gear itself. Clothing is your first line of defense for keeping warm. Yes, you are going to have a tent that's going to keep you nice and warm, but you still have to get to that point, and it can be 8 hours later of your hiking. So it literally is your first line of defense. And depending on how cold it is, the layering system is the best way to go, where you must have at least 2 layers of clothing for warmth, depending on how cold it is. If it's really, really cold, I recommend 3 layers, where you have your base layer, which is very, very tight forming to your body. You have your mid layer, which is on top of that. And then finally your outer layer, and then your coat, okay? Toques and balaclavas and gloves are a must. Extreme cold boots are recommended. The higher the boots, the better. And this is why, the reason why I mentioned that is because if you step in some very, very deep snow, if you wear typically shallow or let's say only ankle high boots, the snow actually will get into your boots and make it very unpleasant. Coveralls and bibs are even better, and we'll talk about that, what that looks like a little bit later on. Merino wool is preferred. It's also the most expensive, but is the best thing you can purchase. And one thing I'm militant about is no cotton. Cotton does not wick water away from your body, and constantly always leaving you chilled, and it can eventually lead to hypothermia, which we'll talk about later on. So here's just a picture of the actual layering system that we talked about, okay? Ideally, you always want a base layer that's tight fitting to your body that will trap in most of the heat, and then you always build on top of that. Now, depending on how cold it is, before I head out on a trip, I always look at the weather closely to see how much clothing I'm gonna bring. If it's gonna be fairly mild, when I say fairly mild, I mean around the -10 mark. And compared to, let's say, if it's gonna be -20, -25 with the wind chill. And of course, you're always adjusting on top of that. And then of course you have your shell and your toque and your gloves and boots on top of that. So now we're gonna talk about hypothermia is the greatest threat to your health while you're traveling. Okay? If you're not prepared for it, hypothermia can set in quite quickly if you're not layered properly. But it does occur when the body temperature drops around the 32 to 35 mark. And the first signs of hypothermia is someone is very, very clumsy, fumbles, doesn't make any sense. That's a first sign that I say, hey, this person might be trying to or getting the hypothermia state. And then one point where it gets really bad and they start shivering. And what I like to do is I like to ask them, can you hold my water bottle for me? If someone can't hold my water bottle for me and they're shivering, you're making camp right then and there, okay? Because it can lead to a very dangerous situation. So we talk about the dangers of actually ice crossing. So no ice is actually safe ice, okay? Minimum ice to walk on a frozen lake or a pond is about 4 inches or 10 centimeters, okay? Of course, the thicker the ice, the better it is for more safety, but ice is one of those things where it's constantly changing and evolving. Depending on temperature fluctuations and where you test ice, it can be very, very different. For example, if you test ice at the very, very base where the shoreline and the water meet, it's always going to be the thinnest just because of constant temperature changes and how deep it is. So we need to test ice several meters or feet away from the shore and get some ideas of how thick that is using ice axes. So depending on the actual body itself of water, ice varies. So it's always thicker, mostly in the center of the lake. The top part of the water freezes first. And every time you come across a current or a river section, it will never freeze because at the molecular level, it warms up a little bit more. So the whole point of this is to test any ice before walking on it. You won't believe how many people I know that don't test ice on a regular basis. And that's the last thing you want to be submerged with freezing water, okay? So even before I actually walk onto a lake, what I like to do personally is I like to stand at the shore and just visually scan the lake itself. Do I see any open spots of water? Do I see any different coloration of ice? When you see discoloration, that means the ice can be potentially thinner at certain areas. So even before I actually step onto the ice itself and test the ice, I always do a visual first. And you can get a lot of information just by scanning the ice itself. Do you see snowmobile tracks on the ice? If you see snowmobile tracks, potentially it could be a lot safer, is because now the snow machines are a lot heavier. So it's a good gauge of who has traveled on that lake before, or if you've seen footprints before. It's always a good idea to have a topographic map or some information on that area, just because anytime you see a low current or river or a bog or marsh, it could be means moving water, potentially breaking through the ice. So what I like to do is what I like to recommend is anytime you are going to be traveling on ice, to have yourself ice axes or ice picks, which I have here. Typically what they do is you always wear them around your neck. That way, in the event that you do go through, you can always grab the ends and drag yourself out. Hopefully you don't have to use them, but just in case, that's one thing I strongly recommend to people starting to winter camp. So here's just basically a list of I have that you have this gear that is recommended, okay? One thing people don't realize that once you start winter camping, because you're dealing with the stove, which is extremely hot, a lot of people don't bring enough of the burned bandages and the like for burns. Okay? Now that you're spending a lot of time with the stove, most likely once you're first starting off, you'll probably get burned a few times. Now, at the very, very middle there, you'll see leather gloves for handling hot stove pipes. So when I first started winter camping, in the excitement of starting winter camping, I actually forgot my leather gloves to handle the stove. So you can imagine trying to handle a stove that's extremely hot using twigs and sticks to try to open your door of this mistake made. So it's critical to have a list and go through the list when you first start out off and check off of what you need or you're going to bring or who's going to bring what, especially if you're going with a group. So here's another action shot. You can see it's very, very deep in the background. The tent's almost camouflaged. So now you must be thinking, how do you actually carry all that gear with you? We were talking about almost 50 pounds or 25 kilos. That's a lot of gear, and it actually is. Now you're gonna forget the backpack. So the use of a duffel bag in conjunction with a sled is a lot easier to organize and see gear. Okay, you can easily carry your own body weight using a sled, as opposed to a backpack. Trying to carry everything on your backpack is almost not very practical. So by switching over to a sled, Now you can easily carry a lot more gear, a lot easier. And the deeper the sled, the better it is. As you're maneuvering and or bushwhacking through trails, it's a lot easier to not get that sled caught or gear snag on brush. And also gear doesn't want to fall out as easy. So you can see here, here's an action shot of when I go on a solo trip. I get a lot of questions about my sled when I come across people. The first thing people ask is, what's with the bungee cord? So in the first few years, you're probably thinking of when you're using string or rope to tie down your gear. It takes a really long time to lash gear down. So one of the things that I don't like to do is trying to expose your bare skin to cold temperatures. So by using rope or fine paracord, you now have to almost remove your gloves, tie down your gear, and then carry on. The problem with that is as you're maneuvering through the bush or through the terrain, gear will want to shift over and not get actually taut. So by having bungee cords, you can easily still wear your gloves, tie gear down, and actually you will have enough give and stretch to keep gear in place. So as you solve one problem, now you create another problem. You notice here, I at the very, very bottom, you'll see that I have paracord that the actual bungee cords latch onto. If you were just to connect the bungee cords onto the sled itself, there's no anchor point for the actual bungee cord. So now you'll have the same problem where gear is going to want to move around and fall out. So by having an actual anchor point on various points of your sled, it will just lash gear down a lot easier. Here's another action shot. Another question I get asked is, what's with the bright colored bags? So in my first 3 years when I was still using string and the like, there was one particular trip where I went camping. Of course, we started off in a blizzard. As we were walking on the trail and our heads down, we're trying to not get the wind and snow in our face. The actual paracord got loose and all the gear started to get peppered all over our trail and we didn't even notice. So after about 300 or 400 meters, we took a water break and we're like, hey, where's all the gear? And of course, at the time, I was using a tent bag that was white in color. And it's like, well, we couldn't find the tent. So ever since that situation, when I switched over to bungee cords, I vowed never for that to happen again. So this is why I always use brightly colored bags. You can see a lot easier. Another action shot of traveling on lake travel. We notice we're all in line with each other. It's a lot easier to actually follow someone else's tracks as opposed to making your own tracks, especially after a deep or a heavy snowfall. So this is what a typical hot tent looks like. Yes, it's actually quite large. This particular size is about 8 by 10 feet, so quite large, or probably not what we're used to compared to, let's say, 3-season tents. So few people remember at the very, very beginning, I said it usually takes about 45 to 60 minutes to actually set up your tent. You're probably thinking, well, why is that? So the way hot tents work is that if you see here at the very, very bottom of this picture, you'll see a black mat or a cloth with a buildup of snow. And what you need to do with every hot tent is this extra fabric is designed to be buried with snow. The reason why it's designed to be buried is because it actually acts as a seal from the floor to the actual tent. Because if you did not bury the bottom part of your tent, cold air would be able to rush in and you wouldn't be able to heat up your tent. Now, on the flip side, when the stove starts running and you're operating your stove for several hours, all that snow starts to slightly melt from the temperature difference from inside the tent compared to the outside. And now this whole base at the very, very bottom starts to slightly freeze. So when you wake up the next morning and the stove goes out, you have this frozen section of ice built up on your stove. Now, when you break down camp, you have to physically remove that snow from your tent in order to break down your tent. And you can't be too aggressive because what happens is if you start using your shovel and picking at it, you can actually damage your cloth that's designed to be buried. So it can be kind of gentle with removing ice. That is why it takes almost an hour and a half to break that down. Now, if you're going solo, it can also take even longer depending how big your tent is. So it's a very, very slow process. And as you can see here, yes, the actual exhaust pipes do come out from the side of your actual tent itself, from the side. So those pipes must be supported in some way. So here's another action shot. I personally like using a tarp over my tent. I find that it traps in heat a little bit better. And also snow tends to slide off a lot easier depending on the snow accumulation that's expected that particular time I'm going. It's a little bit more time to set up, unfortunately, but I find that a lot more beneficial. So this is what my tent looks like on the inside, and we'll talk about why we don't like or shouldn't have a floor for hot tents. So I personally like to use a ground tarp and a blanket, a wool blanket. I find that's the best way. Now, some people like to use boughs. I'm not a very big fan of boughs just because in terms of the conversation portion, and it's unlikely you're actually going to be bringing the boughs with you. So I find that using a blanket and our tarp setup, it's actually a lot easier. I can actually roll that up and bring it with me as opposed to the boughs. You have to find boughs again. Now, the reason why you actually don't want a floor in a hot tent is because as the stove starts running and gets hot, all that snow starts to slightly melt towards the actual tent, the stove itself. So almost creates this slight grade down towards the actual stove. What you can easily do is open your door and actually get more snow and put more snow inside your tent to re-level the floor. If you had a floor, you wouldn't be able to do that. So it's not like in summer camping where you're basically where you leave your tent, you're kind of stuck with that. You can actually elevate and change the height of your floor itself. That's the beauty part. Another thing is when you're bringing wood into the actual tent itself, if you had a floor, you might easily damage the floor if you're still wearing boots. So that's another benefit of not having a floor. You can see here, I have only the back section of the tent covered and not the front part closer to the tent. That way I don't melt of my tarp and also have to worry about removing my boots, entering the tent to bring in wood. So within the actual tent stove itself, you can actually angle the stove how you want, depending on the amount of people you have and the type of tent that you have, right? So when I'm going solo, I like to put the tent angled towards me and angled more towards the center of the actual stove. Now, if I have people with me, I'll angle it closer to the door just to create more room. So one question I get asked a lot is which style of hot tent is better, pyramid or A-frame? And that really comes down to a personal choice. The main difference between A-frames and pyramid is the location of the actual stove itself. With an A-frame, you see on the left, is closer to the door. With a pyramid, it's actually in the center of the actual tent. So the beauty about having a stove in the center of the tent is that it's more of a communal feel. Everyone gets warmth. Yeah, they share the same warmth. People can all participate in sharing the duties of the tent, where in an A-frame is closer to the actual door. So the person who sits closest to the door or the stove gets the warmest, gets the more warmth. So what happened is someone in an A-frame who's just sitting there be like, hey, can you add a few more pieces to that stove? It's getting kind of cold back here, where you may not have that with the actual pyramid style. So it really depends on your personal preference. I strongly would suggest to try both out before you actually go ahead and buy one, because they are quite different, even in terms of setup. Another question I get asked is how hot does it get inside the actual hot tent itself? So let's find out. So you can see here the picture on the left. On a typical trip I did, it was actually, looks like minus 25 without the wind chill. Now the picture on the left is the actual temperature inside the tent when the stove is going, and that is 30 degrees Celsius. You can see it's a huge difference. I have a lot of friends actually wear shorts, believe it or not, when they're hot, and they're like, oh, it's getting too hot and you have to run outside and cool down and run back in. And yes, being warm is a luxury, having all that heat. So you can see it's actually quite comfortable, and no, you're not going to freeze. So now we're going to talk about the chores and duties of gathering wood. So gathering wood, in my opinion, is a necessary evil. You'll probably spend about a third of your day finding and gathering wood. Now they say that gathering wood and burning wood actually keeps you warm 3 times. First, you have to find the wood, then you have to process the wood, and then you finally burn the wood. So it is a necessary evil. And I personally like to do that first thing in the morning. That way I can spend the rest of my day, let's say, doing day hikes and exploring, as opposed to doing it later on in the evening, where now if it starts to get dark, that's the last thing you want to do, is actually try to look for wood when it gets dark, because then you're very limited with time. So you can see here, my buddy is looking for wood. Now you notice that he's not wearing all his layers, right? He's just basically wearing his base layers. And does anyone know what's the hardest part, believe it or not, about winter camping? Anyone guess? The hardest part about winter camping, believe it or not, is not sweating. You are always regulating your body temperature. And the reason why you're doing that is because if, depending on what sort of clothing you have, if you start to get chilled and you start to sweat, it takes a long time for that sweat to evaporate. So you're always regulating your body temperature. This is why when you first start off, you're always bundled up very, very tight with all your layers. And then as you're trekking about 5 minutes later, you're always regulating your body temperature. And typically, depending on how many people are in the group or how cold it is, typically when I'm on the trail, I'm always basically down to my base layers, believe it or not, because you're constantly sweating. So once you find all your gear, once you find all your wood, the rule of thumb is when you think you have enough, you always double it. The last thing you want is to be starting to burn your wood, getting ready for the nighttime when it gets dark around 4:30 or 5 o'clock. You find that by 8 o'clock, oh, we ran out of wood, and I have to find wood in the middle of the night, which can be potentially dangerous with the tripping hazard. So I like to accumulate more wood and chop more wood than I really need to. That way, if it's being left over for the day after, that's not a big deal. The last thing you want is to have not enough wood, depending what time you go to bed at night. And also, it's good to have leftover wood. That way, first thing in the morning, you can wake up, throw some piece of wood in there. You don't have to worry about trying to find wood first thing in the morning when you're freezing. So you can see here, this is a picture when it gets closer to the evening time. And you're probably thinking, what's with the candles? I thought this was a family show. So one thing I like using candles as opposed to a headlight is once it starts getting dark around the 4:30 or 5 o'clock mark, having a headlight on from, let's say, from 4:30 to, let's say you go to bed at midnight, that's a long time. So you end up using a lot of batteries. By having candles, the main point is that it's not as harsh on the eyes. If you're talking to someone inside your tent with their headlight, you're gonna blind them. By having candles spread out, it actually evens out the light, and it's not very harsh in the eyes. Okay. So that way, once you get comfortable, and now the nighttime starts to set in, you can actually get quite comfortable, relax, don't worry about chopping wood. I can see here my buddy has a full-size chair, and actually the bigger the chair, the better. That way it doesn't sink in the actual snow itself. And you can start getting ready for the evening time where you can start making some tea or coffee and debate about politics. And you can see it gets dark very, very quickly in the middle of the bush. You can see how almost welcoming that tent is with that nice glow. Then of course, middle of the night, almost pitch black dark. Now we're gonna talk about the main difference between cold tenting and hot tenting. Now I do have both styles of tents. I actually started cold tenting before I switched over to hot tenting. And for me personally, is socializing in the evening and making meals where if you're cold tenting, you're doing this most likely outside of your tent. You're exposed to the harsh elements outside. And it's not more of a communal feel where if you're now hot tenting, you can all stay inside and make some tea, you can cook dinner all together and not worry about having to go outside, standing up and take that brunt of the forest. This is why you see the tarp in front of our door. That way we don't get exposed to all those harsh elements. So I find that for the social aspect of it, it's a lot more practical and enjoyable in my opinion. Another action shot, cold camping. So now you go to bed, you had your great evening, you had your meals, and now you go to bed. Now, as you wake up in the morning and you crack open your eyes, when the fire goes out, whatever temperature is outside your tent is now, is outside your tent is now inside your tent now. So if it's minus 20 outside, it's gonna be minus 20 inside your tent. So you notice that everything, because of the moisture as you breathe, everything will be frozen and have a fine layer of frost on it. So things will freeze. Cliff bars, contact solution, anything will freeze. Unless you actually put it in your sleeping bag to get a little bit more warmth, it will freeze, okay? And depending on how much gear you have inside your tent, you will be sliding around, depending on how you manage your gear. So now we're going to actually talk about the logistics of food and or water. This is where winter camping shines. You can truly bring anything you want winter camping as long as you're willing to haul it in. So you have to keep in mind that the outdoors is one massive freezer. And then once you get your tent set up closer to the floor, it's actually like a little refrigerator. So you can truly bring anything you want, again, as long as you're willing to haul it in. So you can see here when a typical meal when I make, we almost make it almost competitive on who's going to bring what and what kind of delicious meals that we can make. In this particular picture, we have a seafood medley with chili flakes, garlic, and fresh pasta, believe it or not. I almost eat better when I'm actually in the bush compared to when I'm at home. So what I typically like to bring when I go winter camping from my friends, I like to bring some pretty exotic stuff. I like to bring some like seafood and bring some octopus. Another picture here is some wild boar ground with spinach and fresh penne pasta. We bring a variety of soups, whether being chicken or duck soup. So literally the choice is endless of what you want to bring. I mean, so it's not like that meat or that fish is gonna spoil after one day just because like I used to in 3 seasons. You can truly bring anything you want. Okay? As long as you prepare for it, you can literally bring anything you want. So now we're going to talk about the need to melt snow for water. Right, so a little bit different than probably what you're used to in terms of the 3-season aspect. One of the things that I find that when people start winter camping is they don't drink enough water and they become quite dehydrated very, very quickly. So some people think of being dehydrated is only applies to the summer months. In colder weather, your body has to work a lot harder. You're going to be sweating a lot more just because now you have all these layers of clothing on you. You're hauling a very, very heavy sled. We're talking about maybe about 150 pounds or 200 pounds of weight. And in cold weather, basically your body's thirst response diminishes. So now you get dehydrated even faster. So what I personally like to do is try to force myself to drink every 15 or 20 minutes and force my group to drink every so often. So you'll always have water on the go on your stove, right? And you'll always see pictures of people in their side of their tent with pots and pans always on their stove just because they have water on hand. Sometimes you can actually have a tank, right? Depending on how many people go inside your group, okay? But typically, if you have a tank, you can easily add snow to your stove to melt water. So depending on how many people are actually in your group, you probably will need several pots or in conjunction with an actual tank itself. Now you're probably thinking, well, why not just actually go to a little creek or actually make a little hole inside your that little ice and take out my water filter and start pumping water through my filter like you typically do in the summertime. And the reason why you don't do that, where you have to either melt snow or take out of a creek that's not frozen, is because if you were to use a water pump and pump your water, after you're done pumping, what's going to happen is that filter now will start to freeze solid and then crack and or break your water filter. So this is why you always have to melt snow or take it from a creek and boil it that way to actually prevent it from freezing. So what you like to do then is once water is boiled, I like to actually put it in a sort of insulating mug. That way, several hours later, it still stays warm. You can still have water on demand, especially when you are going to bed at night. I like to boil some water, fill up my insulating mug or bottle. That way, if you are thirsty in the middle of the night, you don't have to exit the tent and try to find water. You can easily crack open your mug and just drink. Okay, so it stays warm for a long period of time. So that's what we do in terms of logistics of water. And yes, you can bring endless treats. We have our midnight feast where we bring pizza and all the good stuff. So yes, there is a lot of cooking and baking to be had before our trips. And yes, we do bring all the goodies. We bring Jiffy Pop, believe it or not. And yes, I do bring some lava cake. We actually started baking some cakes when we were actually on the trail. And there was one year that we were baking a cake and we had some day trippers just pass on through and they're like, we thought we were crazy. We were smelling cake from a mile away. Everyone thought that we were crazy, but yeah, once they came to our tent, they actually saw that we were having some cake. We actually had them sit down in our tent and have a coffee. So, but they couldn't believe the setup. They're like, what is this crazy contraption? So it's quite interesting. So now we're going to talk about the cons of winter camping. Yes, there are some cons. I'm not biased. We're going to talk about the cons, but yes, there are some that we're going to mention today. So first off, winter camping is extremely expensive. So I get a lot of people say to me like, so let me get this straight. It took me years to accumulate and pay for my gear, and now you're telling me I have to buy more gear that's even more expensive? That's crazy. So a typical two-person tent is around the $1,200 to $1,900 mark, depending on which manufacturer you get. So you can see here, it's quite expensive. And that does not include any of the stove or accessories or clothing for that matter. Clothing is also extremely expensive, especially if you buy merino. So I like to tell people is purchase gear slowly, buy your tent, buy your stove, and slowly start to accumulate gear. Rent some gear if you have to while you build up your gear. And then the best thing is to ask people who go winter camping about their gear, whether they like their gear or what recommendations they have. One of the cons is when nature calls. I can't tell you the feeling of having to drop your trousers in the middle of the night when it's -20 outside with the wind chill. Okay, so that's not a very, very pleasant part, but it's hopefully it's quick and short that we can get back to your tent. And of course, cleaning your gear is quite the chore. Now, depending on where you live, it can be quite laborious. So drying your tents, cleaning your stove is very, very laborious, labor intensive. You can see here, I take a few days to dry my tent out. You never want to store a tent when that's where mildew and mold can build up. So you always want to make sure it's completely dry when you store it. But always remember to have fun. It's a great time to go out. Again, it kills winter quite nicely. Again, I look forward to winter camping just as much as I look forward to canoe tripping or river tripping or hiking. So it's a great time to go out. So that's my presentation. So again, if you have any questions, do feel free to ask them.
So I'm curious. I was looking at Esker tents, and I don't want the Wilderness Canoe Association to feel like they're endorsing or like a company, but I was wondering if you can give me a couple of companies that you recommend for tents, because I have a Tent Smith tent, so I'm looking at some other companies right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are several manufacturers out there that do make different tents, depending on your budget. So, and also depends on your style of tent. I mean, if you prefer the pyramid style tents, where they share a center pole and there's no internal frames, there's Esker, there's Atuk, and there's a few other manufacturers out there. In terms of A-frames, there is Snow Trekker. They are very, very, very well known. Oh, yeah. They are made in the US. They are expensive, but they are good. And what makes Snow Trekker very, very unique is that they have an internal frame system. Yeah. So the internal frame systems are a lot easier to erect. They're almost freestanding, but because they're in the US and depending on the exchange rate that particular year or month, they can be quite expensive to bring into Canada. But I mean, the Canadian companies, they are great. It really depends on your preference on tent design. This is why I always say to try it out. I mean, it's unfortunate that we can't do any personal outings this year or in-person outings where I take people out and use my tent. I do have a Snow Trekker, so I like to show people the difference. And we do have people in our group that have a pyramid style tent. We like to set them up side by side. We like to tell people, try them both out. That way you can get a taste for their different characteristics. So it really comes down to personal preference of where you like the stove to be placed.
Luigi, I got a question.
Yeah.
Even I'm leading the question in, but can you tell us the difference between like a typical cotton-based winter tent and a nylon-based tent, and what's the pros and cons?
Sure. I mean, the main difference comes down to the actual abrasive portion of the actual tent. Typical winter tents are not designed to be soaking wet. Now, with climate change, that's being tested. But typically, if you ever notice a typical canvas tent, you can almost grab the strings inside the sewing part and almost separate them. Where if you had a nylon-based tent, you wouldn't have that just because of the characteristics of the actual fabric itself. Now, the downside with nylon is that it does not do very well with heat. This is why companies like the North Face, where they use nylon in their cold tents, do not recommend any sort of contact with heat. So the beauty with cotton that is it is a natural fire resistant to some extent. So this is why anytime you see, let's say, mechanics outfits, they're made of cotton, just because you see anytime they're heating something up with a torch, a little dab of ember falls on their suit, doesn't catch very quickly. So this is why you'll always see cotton majority of the time in hot tents. But you know, it drives me crazy when I see strings come out of my hot tent. That's where the beauty of nylon comes in. You don't get that fraying very easy. So there are pros and cons for both.
Yeah, I found that like I've had friends with the pyramid nylon, and it doesn't wick the water away, so they have an inner skin to the tent. So if the outer skin absorbs the water, moisture droplets, they would drop on an inner layer. With a cotton tent, it sucks the water through basically, because cotton absorbs water, as you mentioned about clothing. The negative in my mind is it weighs a ton the next day because all that water went into the tent walls and roof. So your tent is building weight as you're going along on a trek if you're moving,
Absolutely. Think of it as a sponge. It will absorb and retain all that water and or ice whenever it does freeze. And now you're hauling all that ice with you, unfortunately. And of course, once you get home, as you start driving home, that ice, when you have the heat cranked inside your car driving home, it starts to thaw and you'll be like, well, I didn't bring all that water with me. Why is that all this water there? So yeah, you'll notice that, especially when you're going home. But that's the downside of the nylon. Just like your 3-season tent, it will trap in moisture if you don't have it vented very properly. So again, it comes down to that personal preference of what you like better. I mean, even with cotton, you will see the condensation build up, and this is where you get that slight sort of sheen first thing in the morning with the condensation of your breath. But yes, that's always a problem regardless of which tent you have.
Yeah, I had one friend. She bought can't remember the name of the tent. It was a pyramid style. You could put 4 people around the stove, and she got it pretty cheap because one person bought it. Plus this goat stove, which is titanium, which is really, expensive stove.
Oh, yes.
Anyway, she got a great deal because they went out winter camping once and they, gave up. What happened was that first person nailed her floor or perimeter down, and then you haul up the pole in the middle to set your pyramid. And then the stovepipe is just a little bit offset pyramid. What happened is the base pulled out somewhere, and the nylon touched the stovepipe and burned a whole ton of it, just because it melted it back. And because it's all floppy, it was melting all over the place. So there's like patches all over our tent, even though it's like a, brand new tent, except for where it hit the stovepipe. So you got to be very careful to secure your base before you even prop anything, because if that shifts, you got a hot stovepipe and you could really wreck your tent. Not so much with cotton, because you have that thing there, but that was one thing I learned from her tent. The beauty of a pyramid is you can be all around the stove, so everybody has equal access to the heat, versus a typical A-frame. The person in the bleachers is freezing and the person in the stove is cooking, and keep opening the door, and the person in the bleachers saying close the door.
Yeah, this is why anytime you see, when I personally go out with my A-frame, I have one of those little induction fans that pushes a little bit of hot air back towards the back of the tent. If I have people coming with me. And that's the downside with A-frame, is that the person who at the front of the door is all roasted, while the person at the back is a little bit chilled. Where with pyramid, you're all that communal feel of all around the actual tent itself, and you're toasty. But the downside is, depending on the material you have, anything that touches that exhaust pipe or that stove will burn. Now, if you ever notice that sometimes people will try to bring heat shields and try to protect their stove, but you gotta be very, very careful with the pyramid style, because it's less forgiving in that regard.
Yeah. I noticed Eva in the audience. Eva, you just came back from a trip. over the Christmas holidays. Can you jump in and, talk about some of your experiences maybe? Because I think Eva, you normally cold camp, right? You'll just have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, there is no snow, so it's not much fun, but there is ice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do cold tent. I actually like it because, well, unless it's below -20 consistently, because in the hot tent, you don't see outside, so you might be warm, but you kind of lose yeah, it's just, you're enclosed in that hot bubble. So I think it really depends on temperature. When it's above -20, like between 0 and -20, I much prefer the cold tent with a good sleeping bag. To me, it's nice to sit around the fire and see the trees and yeah.
Yeah. And we're social when we do it. So,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think one of the advantages in my mind, just throwing ideas out here, but like Eva and myself, we generally go cold, although some people bring hot tents. The advantage is we're lighter, so we can really motor and cover, 15K a day on a trek or something, over a hill, over dale, not strictly sticking the lakes and hauling a huge load. Even though I think we generally bring sleighs, the advantage of cold is you're in the 40, 45 pound pack zone. So generally we haul it on flat surfaces like lakes, but when we hit a hill, we just go into backpack mode, carry it over the, mountain, whatever.
Yep.
And then we're back on the next series of lakes. So you end up with cold camping, you could travel further distances in general and over rougher terrain for sure than hauling, 100-pound sled. I don't know, Eva, what do you think about, that
Yeah, for
aspect?
sure. It's it makes a big difference. Yeah, covering larger distances and being more flexible with the terrain. Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
One
Yeah,
thing,
I agree.
one thing I do advise people that if you are starting or thinking about starting to winter camp, I strongly suggest you try hot tenting first as opposed to cold camping. I have a friend of mine, when I first started cold camping, I brought him with me, and he was absolutely scarred for life. And he's like, I'm not doing that again. With hot tenting, I mean, you get a little bit more spoiled in a sense where you can kind of be a little bit more comfortable. It's more practical. You can actually social. You can go to bed at midnight where, if you're lying down on your back with cold tenting, it can be quite an enjoyable experience depending on who's there. So I strongly suggest try the hot tenting first, and then if you like that, then I recommend trying cold tenting, but not the other way around, because it is a little big difference. Meaning, in essence, like Gary said, hot tenting is a form of cold camping where you're still trekking through cold temperatures to get to your site or wherever you may want to be. And then, of course, at the end, it's going to be warm, but you're still bracing the elements and hauling all that gear. So I strongly suggest trying the hot tenting first before if you do want to switch over to cold tenting.
Yeah, ideally, you'd build up your summer skills until you're basically bored. Then you build up your fall skills, and then you're bored. And then you're slowly creeping into winter where, like these conditions right now, it's winter. The lakes are frozen, but there's almost no snow, which is another challenge for water sometimes, unless you can get, access to a little creek or something. But it's like anything, you get the skills. If you also go with a little group and you have somebody that's way more experienced, you latch on to that person and they'll in essence take care of you in a way because you can just replicate what they're doing, and when they're doing it you learn basically by that, which is
and this is the beauty about joining a club like the WCA, where especially for those new members that are not sure what to do, again, I try to have at least one outing a year on hot tenting to show people exactly what to do, what not to do. For example, one of the big mistakes is people like to get green trees or trees that are on the ground for firewood. And the reason why you don't want to do that is because it can be full of moisture and not burn properly. So just small things like that we like to show people. But yeah, you're right, Gary. It can be quite daunting of trying to figure this out all by yourself. And this is where the WCA comes in, where if you partner up with someone and go on an outing, you can learn a lot with a quick overnight trip as opposed to trying to figure this out yourself or look on YouTube for those people that think they're YouTube certified and get the wrong information. So resources like us are key.
I think Fred wanted to say something. He unmuted himself.
You noticed that, Gary?
Yes,
haven't
it's
heard
fine.
anybody
Everybody can
men-
jump in.
Yeah, I have. I haven't heard anybody mention, well, since this session on hot tenting, but maybe it's not surprising. But I've done a lot of winter camping with Quincy's, and I've never used a hot tent, but if it takes 90 minutes to set up your hot tent, you can almost have a Quincy built in that time, and it's quite comfortable inside if you do it right. So that's
Yeah.
another
There's
avenue.
another club that various people in this audience are part of. It's called Five Winds Backcountry Skiing. And that, club is geared more to snowshoeing, skiing, camping, winter camping, stuff like that.
What's it called?
It's called Five Winds Backcountry Skiing. It's based out of Toronto. I know Eve is part of it. I'm part of it. So generally that club, I would say, has WCA members in it and vice versa. But basically that club, I would say is the best in the Toronto area for, winter activities, because they're going out on when it's non-COVID, full Sunday for skiing or snowshoeing in like rugged Canadian Shield territory. And also, some of those members decide to get together and go winter camping for a week or something. I know Eva's organized trips like that. I have done some of those trips. So it's like anything. Every club's got this specialty. Our specialty is more, the water in the summer. Although we do have winter camping people, because people are all part of these groups. But when you seek out clubs that are like that and have experienced people, it's a big benefit being part of a club. In addition, like every member of the WCA can post a trip, like in non-COVID times, of course. And because we're going through this wave of Omicron, we're on a little bit of holding pattern, but hopefully by the spring we'll be go again. So the idea would be, if you were interested in winter camping, you would say, I'd like to go to Algonquin Park. You would post a trip and you would get people that would join you. And then the trip kind of develops into, okay, it's a 2-day weekend trip or whatever it is. So this is the advantage of a club where you can actually seek out people you launched a trip. You don't have to have it totally figured out, because other people that join you will say, well, why don't we go to Smoke Lake? And why don't we go, and the story develops as people, jump into the, I want to go with you. So that's generally the advantage. Same with, summer activities. You could say, I want to go in Algonquin Park in 2022 in June. And as people start signing up, okay, it's going to be June 15th to the June 22nd, you start narrowing it down.
Sure.
And boxing it in. Okay. And so that's how the advantage of the club is basically.
Yeah.
Fred does make an interesting point. I mean, the beauty with the hot tenting shelter specifically is what you're going to get, as opposed to trying to figure out a snow shelter. Depending on the year, there are some years where I've gone winter camping where I had to bail in the middle of a trip because the temperatures climbed to like 3 or 4 degrees, and now we're worried about not being able to get back to our vehicles because we're crossing lakes. Yeah. So what the beauty about the snow shelter is that what you're going to get. It's always consistent, as opposed to trying to build a shelter with whatever snow you may have that particular season. So it's a little bit more consistent. But yes, I mean, like Gary was mentioning, it is quite labor intensive hauling all that gear, especially if you're going solo tripping. I mean, anytime I go solo tripping, everything is very, very slow. I mean, every step you take is like 1-2 steps. You take a breath and you keep carry on, especially going uphill. So depending on what your goal or objective is, if you want to go light and travel light and stealthy, yes, a snow shelter or Quincy may be ideal. But for those that are starting out first, I would strongly suggest hot tenting and then branch out from there, and you'll see the very different styles of camping in general.
Right. Yeah, it's been very interesting to hear more about the hot tenting and the equipment and procedures and so on. And with either that or the snow shelters, probably you'd be wanting to spend a day or two, or a couple of days, or 3 days at any given place, rather than breaking down every day
Yeah.
and then setting up again. I don't know. So it was interesting to me. I never thought about that with the cotton absorbing water and getting heavier through the trip.
Yeah. I mean, it's a
So,
plus and minus because it's sucking the water away from you. So again, when you're sleeping and breathing, even in a normal tent, you got to make sure it's ventilated because you see all your condensation on the walls of the tent. And when you tap it, it snows on you.
yeah.
What I usually do, and maybe Eve does the same, I usually just tarp. So there's tons of insulation. I find that the tarp is simple because it's only £1.25 for the tarp. So we team up. So Luigi would bring a tarp and I would bring a tarp, and his tarp's the floor and my tarp's the roof. And you could set it up in like 5 minutes, but it's
Yeah,
cold camping, you know?
I was just going to say that in the past has been my choice as well.
Yeah.
Sometimes I would use a quinzhee, especially if I was um, taking a group of people out or whatever. But generally, I prefer just a tarp and a
Yeah.
snow trench or something, and
Yeah.
you need the
I've,
proper sleeping gear and clothing and so on, and a few other tricks. But it works pretty well, like you're saying.
yeah, I would
But
say for me, a quincy, like on the side of a lake or something, and if there's snow available, like a foot deep, you can build it with, 3-4 people in about 3 hours personally. So what I would do, what I've done in the past is I, pile, go around in a circle. I like a lake because the snow, there's no branches to, obstacle. The negative is you got to make sure the ice is thick enough, because you get that weight pushing on the ice. It ends up with circular cracks. So I pile all the snow and I stomp on it. And after 3 hours, it's like an 8-foot, 6-7 foot pile. I go make my fire pit for an hour. And when I come back, it's sintered. So now I can dig it out. And there's another 45 minutes with, 2-3 people working on it. So the whole process, in a 3 and a 4 hour kind of zone. The advantage of stomping on it, it does crush the thing. But that quincy, if you come back in a month, still has enough room inside, doesn't shrink because you've sintered the whole pile. I see people on YouTube piling snow and then immediately digging it out. That doesn't work because it's not been sintered and compressed. So over the night, it goes down. The next day goes down. The next day goes down. You come back in a week, you can't even fit a dog in there because it just crushes itself. So I see a lot of things on YouTube that are, not 100%. They might work one night, but if you came back a week later, it'd be half the size. But if you, crush it to begin with, it's in good shape. The
beauty
other
with a hot tent is, sorry, go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, I was just saying the other option is you build a trench, like if the snow is deep enough, and whatever you dug out creates walls about 3 foot high. You put some branches, a tarp, you cover it with snow. That's a quicker shelter in the woods. It's like an hour for a few people to build that one.
As long as you're not claustrophobic, that'll be fine.
That's the issue. Yeah, those shelters
it's basically,
those shelters
it's basically a snow coffin.
But it's a coffin and you have to plug the door to pack. So it's super quiet. I've had -25 outside and like -4 inside. And you crack open the door and you realize your thermometer just went to -25. But when you're rolling over, you're hitting the beams. It's claustrophobic for sure. So you have to wrap your brain around that. Now we've had one we built for a 3-person, 1 dog. And it was, it was beautiful, super quiet, super dark. We didn't even know what time it was in the morning. It was 8 o'clock, beautiful sky. We jumped out. Yeah, it's daylight out here. But inside that little shelter, it was totally dark, But
the beauty with though is, the beauty with the hot tenting is that you can move around from location to location depending on how many bodies you have. The thing with the snow shelter is that you are fixed at that particular spot. Sure. Regardless, you can't take that with you. So if you are interested in exploring an area or series of lakes and such, you can't necessarily do that. So to be with the hot tenting, even though it's quite labor intensive to break it down and set up again, it still gives you that option to travel, especially if you have many people. As the saying goes, many hands make light work. So that's one pro with the hot tent. The only problem is with the Quincy is that depending on that snow year, whether you get a lot of snow or warm spells, it can be quite labor intensive or not very practical. So it would depend on what your objective is.
I have some questions here on the chat, so we'll go from the latest to the past one. Kathy asked about, can you talk a little bit about sleds versus toboggans?
Yeah, so a lot of times depending on the sled versus the toboggan itself, it really comes down to the depth of the actual sled or toboggan itself. You see a lot of sleds that are very, very long, very, very flat, closer to the ground. And those are great if you are on lake travel, just because you can spread out that weight much more easier than, let's say, a deeper sled. The only problem with those is that if you are now navigating through the woods and or forest or bushwhacking for that matter, it'd be very, very challenging to pivot and to rotate that sled. Where if you have a shorter sled, but it's a lot deeper, you can actually maneuver through a dense bush or trees a lot easier. So it really depends on your style or method of travel, lake and or forest, or a mix of both. This is why I like the shorter sled, just because it's a lot easier to move within the actual trees themselves.
Yeah, there's one other feature is you don't want to pile your gear too high, because when you're traversing stuff, you're on diagonals and stuff, and you end up with rollovers. Right. And you're pulling the sled and you got a rollover behind you. Now it's just corkscrewed. It's pulling ropes, and you got to work your snowshoes backwards and flip it. And usually somebody else helps you because your sled keeps rolling over because it's just too top heavy. It also depends on how you pack your sled. Try to pack the heavy stuff low down. And so get the right ratio of width to length to height. If you're too broad, when you're going between trees, all of a sudden you get I can't fit. And if it's too narrow and too high, you're always flipping over, unless you're just on a flat lake or something. But that's a real pain when you have a person flipping over all the time.
Yeah, I thought the sled I saw on the slide looked really wide, but I think it might have been just the camera angle. Because I tried to stretch that out to fill the actual slide itself, but I believe the actual dimensions of that is about 60 centimeters or 24 inches. So it's not horribly massive. You can get them in different sizes depending on how much gear you're going to bring. But yes, it does matter on the width itself. Yeah. Okay.
The beauty with the sled is that once you come across a hill, you can actually jump on the toboggan and go down the hill with all your gear, as opposed to going down. Right. So. But yeah, that's what I like to do. But depending on what sort of groove is made in the actual hill, you can actually go flying and rotate your sled, a 360. But
yeah, I think you could experiment too. Like sleds, you can buy a kid's sled and it will last a season or two if you only go out a few times, because it gets worn, right? Because you're going over rocks and scraping and whatever, and even ice is abrasion. It's just ripping the plastic. So you can get thicker plastic sleds that are more industrial. But of course, they weigh more. So it's a trade-off. Do I buy a $10 sled and it lasts a season or two? Or do I buy a $50 sled, but it's, heavier. It's like 3 times the weight. Like some of those Skidoo sleds, they are heavy, but they're bulletproof because they're made for Skidoo travel, miles and miles and miles. But, they are heavy.
The actual sled I use. Go ahead, Gary.
Well, I'm in the sled/backpack mode because I'm always cold camping. So I generally go for a kid sled about 45 inches long and 21 inches. It's got little flares, so it kind of stabilizes itself. But they do wear out after a year or two, and you just pitch it and you keep your harness system and you put it on the next sled. And the sled's about 3.5 pounds versus 10 or something, 15. So it's a trade-off.
It is a trade-off, and what I've tended to do over the years is kind of find that sweet spot of finding it where it's actually designed to be pulled with a snow machine, but yet still light enough to be able to be pulled manually. Yeah. And just because I find that it's the best of all worlds, you can actually repair those sleds, believe it or not, with some plastic repair kits that I've actually talked about in advanced winter tenting. but you can repair them after a period of time because they, like Gary said, they do wear out. They do take quite a bit of punishment and abuse, and they're not made to last for many seasons. So that's one trade-off. But if you find that sweet spot, you can actually find that balance quite nicely.
Yeah, I guess you got to lay your gear out and just say, this is what I need, and do you go out?
Well, I have those. Yeah, I have the kids sled, and I also have a jet ski I use for ice fishing. You can pull behind machine, and then so I've used both of those, but I haven't done I haven't done enough camping to wear anything out like that.
Yeah.
So, but I see people use the toboggans, and it looks really tempting because they're so lightweight and they're so skinny, So I look at that, but I definitely understand the difficulty of using those in the more hilly terrain.
Yeah.
They look perfect, right? For
You've got to
travel.
You got to figure out what you want to do. Like when you think of canoeing, you're canoeing on a flat lake, and then you do a portage, and you do in there. If you're in that mode, and it's portage trails, they're generally up and over, and they're not too bad. Even myself and others, we're just bush crashing all the way. Dude, there's no trails. We're just going pond hopping to one system to the next system, and that's the way we go because we're bored of trails. How we're bored of summer, we're bored of fall. Now we're doing winter camp. Even winter camping is boring, so we have to make it more exciting by bush crashing or whatever. So that's what the Five Winds does. It's basically a bush crash club. And now with GPS, it's virtually impossible to get lost. But
it's easy.
The challenge is, I think the beauty for me in the winter, it's quiet, as Luigi says, and you see every animal track. So you come along, and when your dog does a 90-degree turn, now you know why he's doing a 90-degree turn, because there's an otter track or a porcupine. So you see a lot of animals. And really, you can do stuff and go places you can't go in the summer. Like you can't paddle in the summer on a 3-inch deep pond, but in the winter you just walk right across it, right? Now you can't go where there's a river, but you can go a lot of places you can't actually get to in the summer because it's just a boggy pond, but in the winter that's a highway.
Well, and I think what's really nice is you don't have to worry about water. I mean, you have to worry about whether it's frozen or not, but you don't have to worry about drinking water. Always available.
With the snow.
If it's snowy.
The challenge comes right now. You even mentioned it. There's almost no snow. There's snow, but there's bare minimal. And then also in the springtime, when everything gets crunchy, it's hard to get snow. So then you have to get water and boil it. The beauty in the winter is snow is, it's basically distilled water, right? As long as it's not yellow, then you're okay.
No yellow snow. No yellow snow.
But, generally you scoop snow, you can eat it right there if you want it. There's no, issues with beaver fever or anything. So that's the advantage. I find it's also like going back to cold versus hot, when you're cold camping with a group, you're sawing the log 6 foot long, you're throwing them in the middle and everybody's gathered around that fire pit. You're not into the 16-inch piece and splitting it. So that's the negative in my mind about hot tenting. But I mean, Luigi, you mentioned it. That's the processing part, right? Yeah.
A third of your day, in my opinion, depending on if you're like, I do a lot of solo tripping, a third of your day is spent processing wood. That's because you have to make sure that your pieces of wood fit in the actual stove itself. But I mean,
and split it. Yeah.
And split it. But I mean, it's a necessary evil, but that's the beauty about hot tenting is that all that labor that you spent that morning or when you do split that wood, now you reap the rewards and you can sit very comfortably in a wood burning stove and be almost mesmerized by that flame and be comfortable and in shorts. But again, that comes with a lot of labor and hours, and I mean hours of splitting wood. So it depends on what your approach is and what you want to do and the social aspect of it. This is why I strongly suggest you try both before you go ahead and spend money on one particular style, because it depends on what you do or maybe what your friends want to do. So this is why I encourage to try everything first.
All right. Is there anybody else in the audience that'd like to, ask a question? I see on the, Rick had a question about carbon monoxide detector. I was going to bring a battery powered one on my first hot tent trip coming up this season. I don't know if Rick's still in the current. Yes, he is here. If you could just unmute Rick, you could maybe jump in.
Hey guys. Yeah, I
Hi.
was just wondering if that's something people do. I went and picked up a battery powered carbon monoxide detector. I've got a snow tracker tent and a seek outside stove that I haven't used yet. I'm going to get it in February and use that with my new toboggan that I just built. But the question really is about, do people bring carbon monoxide detectors when they go hot tenting, and should they?
A very good question. I mean, the carbon monoxide topic is always a concern. I mean, I do know people personally that do bring a carbon monoxide detector and some that don't. What I personally like to do is have vents always open in my hot tent. That way you always get a breeze of fresh air. On the flip side is that you're introducing cold air inside your tent. So you have to make the stove run a little bit hotter, but it's always a concern. So it's a personal choice of how you want to manage that. The good thing with the detector is that if there is traces, you will be alerted. But I mean, it's a risk, right? I mean, you're in this basically this little bubble with wood smoke. So it's as long as you're mindful about always, let's say, circling that air in that tent, or every once in a while going outside. That's what I like to do with the carbon monoxide thing, but it's you're not doing any harm by not bringing one, let's put it that way. So to be on the cautious side, absolutely.
All right.
Okay, there was another question Rick had about pee bottles. And that's an interesting one. I could jump in and throw a few ideas your way. First of all, personally, I don't need one because I seem to be a camel or something. I can sleep in the winter. I can sleep like 11, 12 hours. No problem. Now, when I get up in the morning, I have to go. But in the winter, it's very interesting because it gets dark at 5 o'clock, Toronto area. And, you're eating and whatever, 5, 6. Okay, you're going to bed at 7. And the next morning, you get up at 7. So there's your 12 hours. So back to my tarp thing, because I don't have a real floor, there's an option. You just peel your tarp back and you pee through the floor. That I know some people has done that. I've also known some women that use that special funnel and had, major problems. So my feeling on the whole funnel thing, there was one lady tried it and she didn't get out of her sleeping bag. She just propped herself up and ended up with a flood in her sleeping bag because I heard this commotion in the middle of the night. And then I found out the next morning what happened. So if you really have to go, just get out with your booties on and, do your thing for 30 seconds and jump back in, Somebody mentioned booties up in the chart and I suggested, only bring synthetic booties because you're always touching snow and stuff. If you brought down, they just sucked the water and they would go right down. But synthetic are pretty good. And because you stomped all around your campsite, you can just go out, 10 feet and, squat somewhere and you're all set to go. I don't know,
Yeah.
Luigi, you got no floor in your tent. Is it an option or not?
I mean, for me personally, I do like bringing the booties just because it's a lot easier to put on the booties as opposed to putting on your massive -40 boots. So logistically, especially in the middle of night where you have to go to the bathroom, it's a lot easier. But in terms of that pee bottle, I mean, I'm not a big fan. I mean, let's put it this way. As soon as you unzip your sleeping bag, you're going to get cold and rushing into your bag, which diminishes all that heat. So in my opinion, if I'm going to zip open that bag and get cold, I might as well just sleep in my base layers and make a dart outside and do what I do and then run back in. So, and the last thing you want is to miss.
Yeah, when you unzip, I jump out if I have to, and I close my bag again. Like I don't zip it, but I just flip it back to try to keep the heat in. I actually wear my synthetic booties when I go to bed. So it's like an extra layer on. I don't really have cold feet, but the minute I want to go out, I'm ready to go. I'm in my base layer of, Poly Pro, whatever. And I just run out, do my thing for, you stumble around, but you do your thing for a minute or something, and then you run back in theory. And you just, brush your booties off pretty quickly. Because
absolutely. I mean, the thing with the bottle is that, I mean, if you're going to fumble, and because most likely you're going to be having your sleeping bag open to deal with the bottle. So if you have that sleeping bag open for any considerable amount of time, like even 2 or 3 minutes, that's basically cooling down your bag. So I find that for the pros and cons, it takes a little bit more time coordinating that. So again, I sleep in my base layers. I have to go, just like Gary said, I don't hesitate. 3 seconds later, I close my sleeping bag. That way it retains some heat and you solve that problem. But that's the downside of winter camping, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I guess there are people you can't pee laying down. That's the other technical issue sometimes, you know, I guess in your mind it's saying you're sleeping, so don't pee or something. I don't know. But, you know, you get into these technical things that whatever works for you, I guess, try it. But to me personally, I just run out if I have to really do it. I mean, the other beauty of the hot tent, I think, is if you can get some partners that sleep lighter than you, they might, you know, get the stove going in the morning, right? Or if they have to wake up first, they get the stove going. So that there's an advantage there, I guess.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Are there any other questions, comments, concerns, people?
Well, thank you, Luigi. That was excellent.
Not a
I
problem.
think we got
Not a
some
problem.
good comments. And if anybody wants to talk to Luigi, you saw his email on the website there. You can, I guess, contact you.
Absolutely. I'm sure you'll have some questions as you start to navigate your way through purchasing and or acquiring gear. And again, feel free to reach on out. This is how we do things here at the WCA. So reach out to me if you have any questions. I'm sure you will. So if there are no questions, people, have yourself a great day. Stay safe out there. And we'll see everyone on the trails. Bye now.